man on the other end sputtered out a litany of curses. "You Christless, piss-soaked eight-ball," as well as the expected lecture about, "Do you have any idea what time it is?" But his anger was no match for my desperation. I was doing an excellent rendition of a hysterical relative, which in point of fact is exactly what I was. My sobs easily overpowered this stranger's outrage. His shouts about protocol meant nothing to me. Eventually, he must have realized that his rules were no match for my mayhem, and he went searching for my brother. I waited for a long while, dropping more nickels into the phone, trying to collect myself, listening to the sound of my own ragged breath in the little booth, and then, at last, Walter. "What happened, V?" he asked. At the sound of my brother's voice, I disintegrated all over again into 1,000 pieces of lost little girl. And then, through my waves of sobbing heaves, I told him absolutely everything. "You have to get me out of here," I begged, when he'd finally heard it all. "You have to take me home." I didn't know how Walter managed to arrange it all so fast, and in the middle of the night, no less. I didn't know how these things worked in the military, taking leave and such. But my brother was the most resourceful person I knew, so he'd solved it somehow. I knew he would solve it. Walter could fix anything. While Walter was pulling together his part of my escape plan, gaining leave and finding a car to borrow, I was packing, stuffing my clothes and shoes into my luggage, and putting away my sewing machine with shaking fingers. Then I wrote Peg and Olive a long, tear-stained, self-lacerating letter and left it on the kitchen table. I don't remember everything the letter said, but it was full of hysteria. In hindsight, I wish I'd just written, "Thank you for taking care of me. I'm sorry I was an idiot," and left it at that. Peg and Olive had enough to deal with. They didn't need a stupid 20-page confessional from me in addition to everything else. But they got one anyhow. Just before dawn, Walter pulled up to the Lily Playhouse to collect me and to take me home. He wasn't alone. My brother had been able to borrow a car, yes, but it came with a catch. To be more specific, it came with a driver. There was a tall, skinny young man at the wheel, wearing the same uniform as Walter, an OCS classmate, an Italian-looking kid with a thick Brooklyn accent. He would be taking the drive with us. Apparently, the beat-up old Ford was his. I didn't care. I didn't care who was there, or who saw me in my fragmented state. All I felt was desperate. I just needed to leave the Lily Playhouse right now, before anybody there woke up and saw my face. I could not live in the same building as Edna, not for another minute. She had, in her own cool way, effectively commanded me to leave, and I had heard her loud and clear. I had to go. Right now. Just get me out of here, was all I cared about. We crossed the George Washington Bridge as the sun was coming up. I couldn't even look at the view of New York City retreating behind me. I couldn't bear it. Even though I was taking myself away from the city, I experienced the exact opposite sensation, that the city was being taken away from me. I'd proven that I couldn't be trusted with it, so New York was being removed from my reach, the way you take a valuable object out of a child's hands. Once we were on the other side of the bridge, safely out of the city, Walter tore into me. I had never seen him so angry. He was not a guy to show his temper, but he damn sure showed it now. He let me know what a disgrace I was to the family name. He reminded me how much I'd been given in life and how recklessly I'd squandered it. He pointed out what a waste it had been for my parents to have invested any money whatsoever in my education and upbringing when I was so unworthy of their gifts. He told me what happens to girls like me over time, that we get used, then we get used up, then we get thrown away. He said I was lucky not to be in jail, pregnant, or dead in the gutter the way I'd been behaving. He said I'd never find a respectable husband now.
everything she did. Now the ticking had given way to the ringing of alarm bells. "Hurry up, please. It's time." Jo shivered, even though she was wrapped in the puffy, purple winter coat all three of her daughters made fun of. Underneath, she wore one of her loose cotton tops and a pair of elastic-waisted jeans that had to be at least 15 years old, and sneakers on her feet. "I guess those are her dressy sneakers," Jo had overheard Lila say at the big 70th birthday party Kim had thrown a few years before. Her hair was short, the way she'd always worn it, pale gray because she'd stopped coloring it years ago, and she never wore makeup or much jewelry except for her wedding ring. She wondered what would happen if she let the phone thump to the blue and red carpet, what would happen if she started to scream, and found herself remembering the one actual scene she'd made years ago in a Blockbuster video store when such places had still existed. All those years later, and she could still remember the exact sound she had made, how her laughter had turned shrieky and wild, the smell of the teenage clerk's spearmint gum, and the feel of the girl's hand on her shoulder as the girl had said, "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." She remembered how Lila's shoulders had hunched up high beside the pale, skinny stalk of her neck, and how Melissa's voice had wobbled as she'd said, "We're going, okay? We're going right now." Time, she thought, as she gripped the phone in one numb hand. She needed time, as much as they could give her. Time to make sure that she'd done everything she could to make things right with her sister. Time to make Kim believe that she was a good mother. Time to convince Melissa that doing the right thing belatedly was better than never having done it at all. And Lila. Well, eternity might not be long enough to solve Lila's problems. But couldn't God at least give Jo long enough to make a start? She wanted to groan. She wanted to cry. She wanted to throw the phone at the colorful cardboard display of some superhero movie and the teenagers posing in front of it, snapping selfies, laughing and making faces for the camera as if they were all going to live forever. She felt her wife slip her small hand into Jo's and squeeze. Jo blinked back tears and thought, "Please, God, or whoever's up there, please just give me enough time to make it right." Part 1. 1950. Jo. The four Kaufmans stood at the curb in front of the new house on Alhambra Street, as if they were afraid to set foot on the lawn, even though Jo knew they could. The lawn belonged to them now, along with the house, with its red bricks and the white aluminum awning. Every part of it, the front door and the steps, the mailbox at the curb, the cherry tree in the backyard, and the maple tree by the driveway, the carport, and the basement, and the attic you could reach by a flight of stairs that you pulled down from the ceiling. All of it belonged to the Kaufmans. They were moving out of the bad part of Detroit, which Jo's parents said was crowded and unhealthy, full of bad germs and diseases and filling up with people who weren't like them. They were moving up in the world, to this new neighborhood, to a house that would be all their own. "Oh, Ken," said Jo's mother as she squeezed his arm with her gloved hand. Her mother's name was Sarah, and she was just over 5 feet tall, with white skin that always looked a little suntanned, shiny brown hair that fell in curls to her shoulders, and a pursed, painted red mouth beneath her generous nose. Her round chin jutted forward, giving her a determined look, and there were grooves running from the corners of her nose to the edges of her lips. But that morning, her mouth was turned up at the corners, not scrunched up in a frown. She was happy and as close to beautiful as Jo had ever seen. Jo wrapped her arms around her mother's waist, feeling the stiffness underneath the starch of Sarah's best red dress, the one with a full skirt flaring out from her narrow waist, and 3 big white buttons on either side of the bodice. A smart red hat with a black ribbon band sat on top of Sarah's curls. Her mother put her arm around Jo's shoulders and squeezed, and Jo felt like someone had pulled a blanket up to her chin, or like she was swimming in Lake Erie, where they went in the summertime, and had just paddled into a...
Over and over. The moment seemed lodged in her brain, my mother-in-law told us later. She was struck by the simplicity of the predicament, the profundity of the call for help. Reporters interviewed the aide of the elderly woman who lived on the floor, the woman whose windowsill crumbled. Even in print, I recognized the sickened wonder in her voice, her newly dawning understanding of the malevolence and chaos of the world. It was like an evil force reached down.
We left our Easy Pass in the apartment. Stacy and I realized this only upon arriving at the mouth of the tunnel en route to the Weill Cornell ER. The gate fails to lift as we approach, and we almost plow through it. The man at the toll booth tries to reckon with us, incoherent and hysterical and blocking traffic. "Our daughter's been in a serious accident," Stacy yells to him. He peers behind us at the empty car seat, confused. "Where is she?" he demands. "She's with my mother," Stacy says. Cars honk as the pressure of the line builds behind us. "Please, she's in the hospital," I interject. "Please just let us go." He waves us on. "Just don't get in an accident," he calls into our window as the bar lifts. We'd received the phone call from Stacy's mother, Susan, only 20 minutes before. "Oh, Jayson, it's so horrible," she had said, her first words. The scenario she described was still sketchy. There had been 2 chunks of brick. There were paramedics on the scene. Susan was in the back of a second ambulance, and Greta was in the first, already en route to the hospital. Susan had been struck as well, in the legs. "Where is Greta?" I demanded. "She's up ahead," Susan said. "She's breathing on her own now. They told me she's breathing on her own." Her voice was fuzzy, disoriented, and we heard other muffled voices, paramedics demanding things of her. A male voice cut in behind her, asked Susan something sharply. I could tell from her faltering response that she was struggling to connect the dots. "Susan, please tell me," I said firmly and slowly. "Where did the brick hit Greta? Did it hit her in the head?" When I said the word head, I felt something break up in my voice, an elemental thing I wasn't familiar with yet. "It hit her in the head, yes," Susan said. I yelled this information over my shoulder to Stacy, who screamed instinctively. "My baby girl!" she cried, sobbing convulsively. During the eternal drive up the highway, neither Stacy nor I speak in specifics. She reaches over and grabs my palm, her voice trembling. "She has to be okay. She just has to be. There's no other option." We leave our car behind us in valet parking and run into the lobby. We reach the security guard, and I say it again for the second time. "Our daughter's been in an accident, and she's in the ER." I watch his face soften. I am already learning what happens when you tell people this news. "I'm sorry," he says, and waves us on. There is a visible trail of crisis in the ER entryway, a smear on time leading all the way up the hall, and I feel us walking through it. I hear someone to my left ask, "Are these the parents?" And some part of me registers the grimness of that designation. The parents. Up ahead, a paramedic waves to us urgently. We follow into a corner room, maybe 12 by 12, with a table in the middle and doctors and nurses crowding around it. In the center of it is Greta, stripped down to her diaper and pitifully tiny, her eyes closed and her mouth open. I watch as team members lift her arms and legs like she's a sock puppet. I remember seeing the upper roof of her mouth, the pearly islands of her teeth. I have no memory of the injury on her head. My mind either refuses to note it or has erased it. There are things you see with your body, not with your eyes. Stepping away, I feel something evaporate, a quantum of my soul, perhaps, burning up on contact. I am lighter, somehow immediately less me, as if some massive drill has bored into my bones, extracting marrow. I glance at Stacy, gray and motionless, in a hallway chair, and see the same life force exiting her frame. Susan is on a stretcher down another hallway, out of our sight. We wait. I take out my phone and call my parents on vacation in New Orleans. I try my mother's cell phone first. No answer. I leave a voicemail of some sort. I pace the length of the reception desk, try my father's cell phone. Voicemail. My brother. Voicemail. I have dropped through a wormhole, it seems, or fallen into a crack in time. My unaware family and friends are living above it. On their timeline, Greta is still fine. It is John, my brother, who finally picks up. I try to relay the seriousness of the situation.
Breath, and I took the opportunity to speak while I had the chance. I don't like whiskey. I'm not much of a drinker, just the odd beer, really. Oh, Bobby looked rather annoyed. I don't have any beer. Well, that's fine. I don't need a drink. Well, I do, honey. It's been one of those days. Barbie poured herself a large glass of red wine and curled up in the armchair, like she was settling in for a good chat. I'm all yours, she said with a flirtatious smile. What do you want to know? I have a couple of questions, if that's all right. Well, fire away. Did Alicia ever mention seeing a doctor? A doctor? She seemed surprised by the question. You mean a shrink? No, I mean a medical doctor. Oh, well, I don't... Barbie trailed off and hesitated. Actually, now you mention it, yes, there was someone she was seeing. Do you know the name? No, I don't. But I remember I told her about my doctor, Dr. Monks, who's just incredible. He only has to look at you to see what's wrong with you straight away, and he tells you exactly what to eat. It's amazing. There followed a long and complicated explanation of the dietary requirements demanded by Barbie's doctor, and an insistence I pay him a visit soon. I was starting to lose patience. It took some effort to get her back on track. You saw Alicia on the day of the murder? Yes, just a few hours before it happened. She paused to gulp some more wine. I went over to see her. I used to pop over all the time for coffee. Well, she drank coffee. I usually took a bottle of something. We'd talk for hours. We were so close, you know. So you keep saying, I thought. But I had already diagnosed Barbie as almost entirely narcissistic. I doubted she was able to relate to others except as a function of her own needs. I imagined Alicia didn't do much talking during these visits. How would you describe her mental state that afternoon? Barbie shrugged. She seemed fine. She had a bad headache, that was all. She wasn't on edge at all. Should she be? Well, given the circumstances. Barbie gave me an astonished look. You don't think she was guilty, do you? She laughed. Oh, honey, I thought you were smarter than that. I'm afraid I don't... Alicia was no way tough enough to kill anyone. She wasn't a killer. Take it from me, she's innocent. I'm 100% sure. I'm curious how you can be so positive given the evidence. I don't give a shit about that. I've got my own evidence. You do? You bet. But first, I need to know if I can trust you. Barbie's eyes searched mine hungrily. I met her gaze steadily, and then she came out with it just like that. You see, there was a man. A man? Yes, watching. I was a little taken aback and immediately alert. What do you mean, watching? Just what I said, watching. I told the police, but they didn't seem interested. They made up their minds the moment they found Alicia with Gabriel's body and the gun. They didn't want to listen to any other story. What story, exactly? I'll tell you, and you'll see why I wanted you to come over tonight. It's worth hearing. Just get on with it, I thought, but I said nothing, and smiled encouragingly. She refilled her glass. It started a couple of weeks before the murder. I went over to see Alicia, and we had a drink, and I noticed she was quieter than usual, and I said, "Are you okay?" And she started crying. I had never seen her like that before. She was crying her eyes out. She was normally so reserved, you know, but that day she just let go. She was a mess, honey, a real mess. What did she say? She asked me if I'd noticed anyone hanging around in the neighborhood. She'd seen a man on the street watching her. Barbie hesitated. I'll show you. She texted this to me. Her manicured hands stretched for her phone, and she searched through her photos on it. She thrust the phone at my face. I stared at it. It took me a second to make sense of what I was seeing. A blurred photograph of a tree. What is it? What does it look like? A tree? Behind the tree. Behind the tree there was a grey blob. It could have been anything from a lamppost to a large dog. "It's a man," she said. "You can see his outline quite distinctly." I wasn't convinced, but didn't argue. I didn't want Barbie to get distracted. "Keep going," I said. "That's it." "But what happened?" Barbie shrugged. "Nothing. I told Alicia to tell the cops, and that was when I found out she hadn't even told her."
Graham and Karen each had a bedroom off the kitchen. Pete and Eddie took the garage. Billy and Camila wanted the loft, so I got the only bedroom with a bathroom in it.
Graham. Warren's bedroom had a toilet in it. He used to say he had his own bathroom, but he didn't. His room had a toilet, just in the corner of the room.
Billy. Teddy was a night owl, so we would all head out to the studio in the afternoon and stay pretty late into the night, sometimes into the morning. When we were recording, the rest of the world didn't exist to us. You're in that dark studio thinking of nothing but the music. Me and Teddy, we were knee-deep in it, speeding up tempos and recording in different keys, trying out everything. I was playing around with new instruments. I was lost to it all at the studio, but then I'd come home and Camila would be asleep, sheets around her. I'd be a little drunk usually, and I'd slip into bed right next to her. It was always the mornings that I got to spend with Camila back then. The way most couples go out to dinner at the end of a long day, Camila and I would go out to breakfast. Some of my favorite mornings were the ones where I wouldn't even bother going to sleep. Camila would wake up and two of us would drive on down to Malibu and have breakfast along PCH. Every morning she'd order the same thing, an iced tea, no sugar, 3 lemon slices.
Camila. Iced tea, 3 lemons. Club soda, 2 limes. Martini with 2 olives and an onion. I'm particular about my drinks. I'm particular about a lot of things.
Karen. You know, people think of Camila as following Billy everywhere, taking care of Billy all the time, but it wasn't like that. She was a force to be reckoned with. She got what she wanted almost all the time. She was persuasive and kind of pushy, although you never really realized you were being pushed. But she was opinionated and knew how to get her way. I remember this one time she and Billy came down into the living room one morning, just a bit before noon maybe. We were all in last night's jeans, that kind of thing. We weren't going into the studio until much later. Camila said, "You all want to make a big breakfast? Pancakes, waffles, bacon, eggs, the whole 9? But Billy had heard that Graham and I were going to get a burger and he wanted to go with us. So Camila said, "I'll just make you all burgers here." And we said fine. So she sent Billy out for hamburger meat and told him to get bacon too, and eggs for tomorrow. Then she fired up the grill and came in to tell us the burger meat Billy got didn't look so good, so she'd just make bacon. And while she was making bacon, might as well make eggs. And if she had the eggs out, she might as well make some pancakes too. Suddenly, it was 1:30 and we were all sitting around the table to eat a brunch and there wasn't a single burger in sight. All of it tasted great and no one even noticed what she had done except me. That's what I loved about her. She was no wallflower. You just had to be paying attention to see it.
Eddie. The rest of us were always gone, most of the time at least, and I just assumed Camila might help around the house, might clean a bit, you know what I mean? I said one time, maybe while we're gone you could tidy up or something.
Camila. I said, all right. And then I proceeded to not clean a single thing.
Graham. It was a busy time. Billy was always writing. We were always working on some element or another, in and out of the studio, sleeping there sometimes. So many nights Karen and I would stay up until the sun came up, working on a riff or a melody.
Warren. That was when I grew my mustache. See, now, some men just can't pull off a mustache, but I can. I grew it when we were recording our first album, and I have never shaved it. Well, I shaved it one time, and I looked like a skinned cat, so I grew it back.
Recording an album, especially a debut, it takes a lot out of you. Billy became a little obsessive. I think that's why when the rest of us might have done a bump in the studio, I think that's why Billy started doing lines every day. He was staying in the zone.
I was intent on making sure that album was the greatest album anyone had ever released since the dawn of time. Let's just say I wasn't known for keeping things in perspective back then.
Billy took a lot of control over that album, and Teddy let him. Billy would write the songs, write almost everybody's parts. He'd come in and he'd know the guitars and the keys and what he wanted on the drums. He wasn't on Pete as much. He let Pete have a little bit more leeway.
To me. If I were a boy, it would be a different matter, but my delight in working out probabilities when I was 7 years old was of no help to my mother, who'd just been widowed at the time. In the sad vacuum of my father's passing, I spent hours penciling numbers on scraps of paper. They were sensible and orderly, unlike the chaos our household had descended into. Despite that, my mother kept her sweet, vague smile, the one that made her look like the goddess of mercy, though she was probably worrying what we'd eat for dinner. I loved her fiercely, though more about that later. The first thing the dance hall mama told me to do when I was hired was to cut my hair. I'd spent years growing it out after teasing from my stepbrother's shin about how I looked like a boy. Those 2 long braids, neatly tied with ribbons, just as they'd been all the years I'd attended the Anglo-Chinese girls' school, were a sweet symbol of femininity. I believed they covered up a multitude of sins, including the unladylike ability to calculate interest rates on the fly. No, the mama said, you can't work for me like that. But there are other girls with long hair, I pointed out. Yes, but not you. She sent me to an alarming woman who snipped off my braids. They fell into my lap, heavy and almost alive. If Shin could see me, he'd die laughing. I bent my head as she clipped, the nape of my exposed neck frighteningly vulnerable. She cut bangs in front, and when I raised my eyes, she smiled. Look beautiful, she said. Look exactly like Louise Brooks. Who was Louise Brooks, anyway? Apparently, a silent movie star who was wildly popular a few years ago. I blushed. It was difficult to get used to the new fashion in which flat-chested tomboys like me should suddenly become popular. Of course, being in Malaya and on the far outskirts of the empire, we were sadly behind in style. British ladies who came east complained of being 6 to 12 months behind the London fashions. It was no surprise, then, that the craze for ballroom dancing and cropped hair was finally hitting Ipoh when they'd been in full swing elsewhere for quite a while. I touched the shaved nape of my neck, afraid that I looked more like a boy than ever. The mama, shifting her large bulk, practically said, You'll need a name, preferably English. We'll call you Louise. So it was as Louise that I was dancing the tango that afternoon of June 3rd. Despite the faltering stock market, our bustling town of Ipoh was giddy with the rush of new buildings built on the wealth of tin and rubber exports. It was raining, an unusually heavy downpour for mid-afternoon. The sky turned the colour of iron and the electric light had to be switched on, much to the dismay of the management. Rain drummed loudly on the tin roof, which the band leader, a little Goanese with a skinny moustache, tried his best to drown out. The craze for Western dancing had led to the mushrooming of public dance halls on the outskirts of every town. Some were grand affairs,
like the newly built Celestial Hotel, while others were no more than large sheds open to the tropical breeze. Professional dancers like myself were kept in a pen, as though we were chickens or sheep. The pen was a section of seats separated by a ribbon. Pretty girls sat there, each with a numbered paper rosette pinned to her breast. Bouncers ensured that nobody approached us unless they had a ticket, though it didn't stop some men from trying. I was rather surprised that someone asked me to tango. I'd never learned it properly at Miss Lim's dancing school, where, as consolation for being forced to leave school by my stepfather, I'd been taught to waltz and, more daringly, foxtrot. The tango, however, wasn't taught. It was too risque, although we'd all seen Rudolph Valentino dance it in black and white. When I started at the Mayflower, my friend Hui had said I'd better learn it. "You look like a modern girl," she said. "You're bound to get requests." Dear Hui. She was the one who taught me, the two of us staggering around like drunkards. Still, she tried her best. "Well, perhaps nobody will ask," she said hopefully, after a sudden lurch almost brought us down. Of course, she'd been wrong. I quickly learned that the kind of man who requested the tango was usually a buaya, and the one on that ill-fated 44th day was no exception. He was a salesman, he said, specializing in school and office supplies. Immediately, I recalled the crisp cardboard scent of my school notebooks. I'd loved school, but that door was closed to me now. All that remained was the idle chatter and heavy feet of this salesman, who told me that stationery...
I might get a second opinion about this. The surgery costs 11,000 euros per lung. Yikes. I vowed when I started writing my way through this calamity that I would endeavor to be honest about who I am and what it is for me to battle cancer. That I would strive against my very human egoist tendencies to prop up some persona of myself as perpetually inspiring, strong, or wise. Why was this so important to me? In part because if this writing were to become the principal means by which my children would come to know my innermost thoughts and feelings after my death, I wanted them to see my real self. A self that, in addition to experiencing many moments of joy, gratitude, and insight, was often tormented by fear, anger, hurt, despair, and darkness. I also made that promise because I disliked tremendously those bloggers who always presented in the face of a life-threatening illness images of pumped fists and unending positivity and determination. To me, such portrayals were disingenuous, an insult to the intelligence of readers, and, above all, disorienting and potentially harmful for those like myself who were newly diagnosed and felt more darkness than light. I wanted to detail and explore that darkness, to let others out there who I knew experienced a similar desolation and lonely darkness know that they were not and are not alone. There is a natural, intuitive fear of darkness. People who are gripped by it are ashamed to speak of it, while those who are free of it for however long wish to run from it as if it were a contagious plague. If the cost of my brutal honesty about my darkness is a highly unflattering picture of me that repels, so be it. In the weeks after I received the news, I fell into a darkness that was 1,000 times worse than anything I had experienced before. I managed to get through Christmas Day, and the full force of the darkness hit me the day after. It left me broken and crumpled on the ground, my rage-filled screams ringing in its wake, and a husband and children utterly shocked at the madness they had never thought possible in this woman who was supposed to be their steadfast wife and mother. Yes, Josh had seen me angry and despairing before, but never like this. For this frightened him. This made him afraid for his own and his children's safety, because I was like a deranged animal, devoid of reason, hope, and light.
I yelled and hurled things, not at Josh or the children, but at the heartless gods who would do this to me. And in the absence of those gods, at the painfully unjust cruelty that is an inherent part of the human existence. Why me? I demanded of the gods. Hadn't I already borne my share of trials and tribulations? Hadn't I already known enough suffering? Hadn't I lived a good and moral life? The absence of any divine answer arising from the chaos of my thoughts made me even more crazed. Even the gods cower from me. Cowards. Through heaving sobs, I begged Josh to let me go. To let me leave him and our girls forever. For all I wanted to do was flee. Get on an airplane bound for unknown parts, where I could die alone with the setting sun. In the state I was in, I was a completely unfit mother and wife. An unfit human being, for that matter. I tried to convince Josh that my leaving would be for the best. That he is still a young, handsome man with a successful career, and he would be able to find someone to replace me easily. That any woman would love our girls. That the girls are so young they would grow to love their new mother easily enough. I wanted not to fight, but to flee to a place where I could die. I told Josh I didn't want to live like this, with this diseased body that had failed me one time too many, with the specter of death looming ever closer. That this was no longer a life worth living. That whatever good that would come from now on, whatever laughter, whatever joy, would be poisoned by the cancer. And I didn't want a life poisoned by cancer. I wanted to start over. I wanted to find escape and rebirth in death. And then I grew angry at the image of this other woman who would have the time and life I should have had with Josh and my girls. I hate her. This woman I don't even know. I vow that if she does wrong by Josh and my children, I will hurt her.
Narrows, and leads into surprising space. A chamber is entered. Sound now booms, resonates. The walls of the chamber appear bare at first, but then something extraordinary happens. Scenes from the Underland start to show themselves on the stone, distant from one another in history, but joined by echoes. In a cave within a scarp of karst, a figure inhales a mouthful of red ochre dust, places its left hand against the cave wall, fingers spread, thumb out, palm cold on the rock, and then blows the ochre hard against the hand's back. There is an explosion of dust, and when the hand is lifted, its ghostly print remains, the stone around having taken the red of the ochre. The hand is shifted. More dust is blown, and another pale outline is left. Calcite will run over these prints, sealing them in. The prints will survive for more than 35,000 years. Signs of what? Of joy? Of warning? Of art? Of life in the darkness? In the shallow, sandy soil of northern Europe, some 6,000 years ago, the body of a young woman, dead in childbirth along with her son, is lowered gently into a grave. Next to her is laid the white wing of a swan. Then onto the wing is placed the body of her son, so that the baby is doubly cradled in death, by the swan's feathers and his mother's arms. A round mound of earth is raised to mark their burial place, the woman, the child, and the white swan's wing. On an island in the Mediterranean, 300 years before the founding of the Roman Empire, a metalworker completes the design of a silver coin. The coin's face shows a square labyrinth with a single entrance on its upper edge and a complex path to its center. The walls of the labyrinth, like the rim of the coin, are slightly raised and polished to a sheen. Tooled into the labyrinth's center is the figure of a creature with the head of a bull and the legs of a man, the Minotaur, waiting in darkness for whatever comes next. 600 years later, a young woman sits for a portrait painter in Egypt. She has dressed most handsomely for the sitting. She has strong dark eyebrows and wide dark eyes, almost black. Her hair is pulled back from her forehead by a metal band topped with a gold bead, and she wears a golden scarf and brooch. The painter works with hot beeswax, gold leaf, and coloured pigments, layering them onto wood. He is creating the young woman's death image. When she dies, it will be wrapped into the bands of cloth used to mummify her corpse, such that it takes the place of her real face. As her body decays beneath its swaddling, the portrait will remain unaged. It is well to do such things early, when one looks most glowing. Her body will be placed in a necropolis, a city of the dead built at the entrance to a sunken depression of desert, in a buried chamber lined with limestone and covered with quartzite slabs to deter grave robbers, close to vaults that hold the mummified corpses of more than 1 million ibises. Beneath a plateau in southern Africa, late in the 19th century, miners crawl through miles of narrow tunnel, cut deeper underground here than anywhere else on Earth at this time, lugging ore from a sunken reef of gold. Some of these men, who have migrated to the area in their thousands to work, will die soon in rockfalls and accidents. More will die slowly of silicosis from breathing the rock dust down there in the killing dark, year after year. Here, the human body is largely disposable in the view of the corporations that own the mine and the markets that drive it. A small, unskilled tool of extraction to be replaced when it fails or wears out. The ore the men bring up is crushed and smelted, and the wealth it yields lines the pockets of shareholders in distant countries. In a cave in the foothills of the Indian Himalayas not long after partition, a young woman meditates 16 hours a day for 75 days. She sits stone still while meditating, save for her mouth, which moves as she murmurs mantras. She emerges most often at night. When it is cloudless, the Milky Way can be seen spilling across the sky above the peaks. She lives on water drunk with cupped hands.
She was a nurse in training at Montefiore and lived in hospital housing with a colored girl, also a nurse. Was that the way it was for the Irish? Because he'd dated a Russian girl for a while, and the only people she hung around with were other Russians. "I'm Irish too," Stanhope said. "But back a ways." That was another thing about America. Everyone was Irish, but back a ways. Might be a sign of intelligence, keeping away from our lot, Francis said with a straight face. It took Stanhope a minute. At graduation, Mayor Lindsay stood at the podium, and from his third-row seat, Francis thought about how strange it was to see in person a man he'd only ever seen on TV. Francis had been born in New York, was taken back to Ireland as an infant, and had returned just before his 19th birthday with $10 American and citizenship. His father's brother, Patsy, had picked him up from JFK, taken Francis's duffel from his hand and thrown it on the back seat. "Welcome home," he'd said. The idea of this teeming foreign place as home was mystifying. On his first full day in America, Patsy put him to work behind the bar at the pub he owned on 3rd Avenue and 80th Street in Bay Ridge. There was a framed shamrock over the door. The first time a woman came in and asked him for a beer, he'd taken out a highball glass and set it down in front of her. "What's this?" she asked. "A half beer?" She looked down the row at the other people sitting at the bar, all men, all with pints in front of them. He'd shown her the pint glass. "This is what you want?" he'd asked. "The full of it?" And understanding, finally, that he was new to the bar, new to America, she'd leaned over to cup his face, to brush the hair off his forehead. "That's the one, sweetie," she'd said. One day when Francis had been in New York for about a year, a pair of young cops came in. They had a sketch of someone they were looking for, wanted to know if anyone at the bar recognized him. They joked around with Patsy, with Francis, with each other. When they were leaving, Francis mustered up some of that American inquisitiveness. How hard was it to get on the cops? How was the pay? For a few seconds, their faces were inscrutable. It was February. Francis was wearing an old cable sweater that had been Patsy's, and felt shabby next to the officers in their pressed jackets, their caps that sat rightly atop their heads. Finally, the shorter of the two said that before becoming a cop, he'd been working at his cousin's car wash on Flushing Avenue. Even when it all went automated, the sprayers would get him, and in the winters he'd end the day frozen through. It was too brutal. Plus, it was a lot better telling girls he was a cop than telling them he worked a car wash. The other young cop looked a little disgusted. He'd joined because his father was a cop, and two of his uncles, and his grandfather. It was in his blood. Francis thought about it through that winter, paying more attention to the cops in the neighborhood, on the subways, moving barricades, on television. He went to the local station house to ask about the test, the timing, how it all worked, and when. When Francis mentioned his plan to Uncle Patsy, Patsy said it was a sound idea. All he needed was 20 years, and then he'd have his pension. Francis noticed that Patsy said, 20 years, as if it were nothing, a mere blink, though at that moment it was more than the length of Francis's whole life. After 20 years, as long as he didn't get killed, he could do something else if he wanted. He saw his life split up into blocks of 20, and for the first time he wondered how many blocks he'd get. The best part was he'd still be young, Patsy said. He wished he'd thought of it when he was Francis's age. After graduation, his class had been split into groups to do field training in different parts of the city. He and 30 others, Brian Stanhope among them, were sent to Brownsville and then to the Bronx, where the real job began. Francis was 22 by then. Brian was only 21. Francis didn't know Brian well, but it was comforting to look across the room at muster and see a familiar face. Nothing, so far, had happened the way they'd been told things would happen. The station house itself was the exact opposite of what Francis had imagined when he decided to apply to the police academy. The outside was bad enough, the facade chipped and peeling, covered in bird shit and crowned in barbed wire, but inside was worse. There wasn't a surface in the place that wasn't damp or sticky or peeling. The radio...
Packaged in Colombia. Why does it say packaged in Colombia? Why not say packaged in France? Gomez said. Because that's against the law, Clark said. You're packing them right here, am I right? The French motif is a sales device. Yes, that would be unethical, Gomez, Don Ernesto said. You could use the Honduran song Sopa de Caracol in commercials, Gomez suggested. It isn't French, Clark said. The labels will have animal glue on them. Will we have to lick them? The plant manager asked. No, Senor Valdez. After we test mark it, we will buy a labeling machine, Don Ernesto said. You just can them. Show me the shells. Valdez lifted a box onto the table. He took out a handful of snail shells and put them on the table. Gomez smelled one and wrinkled his nose. They smell of old butter and garlic. The restaurants don't wash them before they throw them out. They just scrape the plates. Well, we tried soaking them, but the Clorox dims the color, Valdez said. Try Fab with lemon-freshened borax, said Gomez, a bachelor. Don Ernesto pushed the drawings away. Senor Clark, I want you to put something simple and elegant on the label. A candle, a woman's hand on the stem of a wine glass. I want you to convey, you serve these high-class snails to a lady, and she will see you for the man you are. And maybe she will give you some gatita dulce as soon as she finishes the snails. That means pussy, Gomez explained. He knows what it means, Don Ernesto said. Now, Valdez, which of these snails are the real French? The green plate. Ah, then one plate has the finest French snails, the other is from our own production. You can see the two appear identical, and I believe there's no difference in the dining experience. Shall we try them? Don Ernesto said. Everyone appeared apprehensive. Valdez said, Permiso, Don Ernesto, if it is possible. That's why we brought Alejandro. Get him, Gomez. Don Ernesto selected a French snail from the green plate and made a production of eating it as Gomez returned with Alejandro, a man of about 35. Alejandro wore a straw Borsalino hat, an ascot, and a flowing pocket square. Don Ernesto put his shell onto the blue plate. Alejandro is a man of the world and a distinguished gourmand and food critic. And, Mr. Clark, Alejandro has friends at all the shelter magazines. Alejandro took a seat and shook hands with Clark. Don Ernesto's very kind. I just enjoy my meals, and some people think I'm a grape nut. Don Ernesto poured him some wine. Clear your palate, my friend. First, try the escargot native to the south coast of Provence, in France. Don Ernesto proffered the French snails. Alejandro worked one around in his mouth. He took a swig of wine and nodded his head vigorously. Don Ernesto offered an example of his own production. And now, those of Brittany, also in France. Alejandro dug it out of the shell and chewed and chewed. The flavor's similar, Don Ernesto, but the second batch have more texture, and the flavor's a bit more insistent. Gomez was seized with a sneezing fit and had to cover his face with the fat end of his tie. Would you buy them? Don Ernesto said. I would actually prefer the first sample, but if I couldn't get that, yes, I'd buy the second one. The second group of snails has been purged in chlorinated water, I think. There's the slight chlorine aftertaste that I find so vexing in city water. You might address that with the Brittany people. Would you say the texture is sensual? Should we emphasize what you wine experts call mouthfeel? Definitely, Alejandro said. Mouthfeel, the texture sensual, the flavor insistent. Conceptually, that's the direction we are taking, Clark said. I'm thinking a lip card for the grocery store shelves, something like, C'est si bon, get it on. Mr. Clark, Alejandro, pour yourselves a glass of wine to take with you, and I will meet you at the cars. Gomez filled his glass. This wine could be more insistent, he said. Valdez unlocked the door to the workrooms and locked it again behind him.
There was one other Arab on board the ship to Marseille. His name was Farouk al-Azmeh, and the day after leaving port in Alexandria he approached Midhat at breakfast, with a plate of toast in one hand and a string of amber prayer beads in the other. He sat, tugged at the cuffs of his shirt, and started to describe without any introduction how he was returning from Damascus to resume his teaching post in the language department of the Sorbonne. He had left Paris at the outbreak of war, but after the miracle of the Marne was determined to return. He had grey eyes and a slightly rectangular head. "Paris," he sighed. "It is where my life is." To young Midhat Kamal, this statement was highly suggestive. In his mind, a gallery of lamps directly illuminated a dance hall full of women. He looked closely at Farouk's clothes. He wore a pale blue three-piece suit,
and an indigo tie with a silver tie-pin in the shape of a bird. A cane of some dark, unpainted wood leaned against the table. "I am going to study medicine," said Midhat, "at the University of Montpellier." "Bravo," said Farouk. Midhat smiled as he reached for the coffee pot. Muscles he had not known were tense began to relax. "This is your first visit to France?" said Farouk. Midhat said nothing, assenting. 5 days had passed since he said goodbye to his grandmother in Nablus and travelled by mule to Tulkarem, where he joined the Haifa line for Kantara East and changed trains for Cairo. After a few days at his father's house, he boarded the ship in Alexandria. He had become accustomed to the endless skin of the water, broken by white crests, flashing silver at noon. Lunch was at 1, tea was at 4, dinner was at 7:30, and at first he sat alone watching the Europeans eat with their knives. He developed a habit of searching a crowded room for the red hair of the captain, a Frenchman named Gorin, and after dinner would watch him enter and exit the bridge where he supervised the helm. Yesterday, he started feeling lonely. It happened suddenly. Sitting beside the stern, waiting for the captain, he became conscious of his back against the bench, a sensation that was bizarrely painful. He was aware of his legs extending from his pelvis. His nose, usually invisible, doubled and intruded on his vision. The outline of his body weighed on him as a hard, sore shape, and his heart beat very fast. He assumed the feeling would pass, but it did not, and that evening simple interactions with the quartermaster, dining attendants, and other passengers took on a strained and breathless quality. It must be obvious to them, he thought, how raw his skin felt. During the night, he pressed the stem of his pocket watch compulsively in the dark, lifting the lid on its pale face. The ticking lulled him to sleep. Then he woke a second time and, continuing to check the hour as the night progressed, began to see in those twitching hands the spasms of something monstrous. It was with a strong feeling of relief, therefore, and a sense that his sharp outline had softened slightly, that he smiled back at his new friend. "What do you imagine it will be like?" said Farouk. "Imagine what? France?" "Before I came, the first time, I had many pictures of it in my mind. Some turned out to be quite accurate in the end, some were—" He pinched his lips and smiled in self-mockery.
Equates Margot's feelings with a complaint. But if I stay in the content, we won't connect at all this session. And John, I'm learning, is somebody who has trouble making contact with the people in his life. John, I try again. I wonder if we can go back to what just happened. Oh, good, he says, cutting me off. I still have 20 minutes left. And then he's back to his story. I sense a yawn coming on. A strong one. And it takes what feels like superhuman strength to keep my jaw clenched tight. I can feel my muscles resisting, twisting my face into odd expressions. But thankfully, the yawn stays inside. Unfortunately, what comes out instead is a burp. A loud one, as though I'm drunk. I'm not. I'm a lot of unpleasant things in this moment, but drunk isn't one of them. Because of the burp, my mouth starts to pop open again. I squeeze my lips together so hard that my eyes begin to tear. Of course, John doesn't seem to notice. He's still going on about Margot. Margot did this, Margot did that. I said this, she said that. So then I said. During my training, a supervisor once told me, there's something likable in everyone. And to my great surprise, I found that she was right. It's impossible to get to know people deeply and not come to like them. We should take the world's enemies, get them in a room to share their histories and formative experiences, their fears and their struggles, and global adversaries would suddenly get along. I've found something likable in literally everyone I've seen as a therapist, including the guy who attempted murder. Beneath his rage,
He turned out to be a real sweetheart. I didn't even mind the week before, at our first session, when John explained that he'd come to me because I was a nobody here in Los Angeles, which meant that he wouldn't run into any of his television industry colleagues when coming for treatment. His colleagues, he suspected, went to well-known, experienced therapists. I simply tagged that for future use when he'd be more open to engaging with me. Nor did I flinch at the end of that session, when he handed me a wad of cash and explained that he preferred to pay this way because he didn't want his wife to know he was seeing a therapist. "You'll be like my mistress," he'd suggested. "Or actually, more like my hooker. No offense, but you're not the kind of woman I'd choose as a mistress, if you know what I mean." I didn't know what he meant. Someone blonder, younger, with whiter, more sparkly teeth? But I figured that this comment was just one of John's defenses against getting close to anybody or acknowledging his need for another human being. "Ha ha, my hooker," he said, pausing at the door. "I'll just come here each week, release all my pent-up frustration, and nobody has to know. Isn't that funny?" "Oh yeah," I wanted to say. "Super funny." Still, as I heard him laugh his way down the hall, I felt confident that I could grow to like John. Underneath his off-putting presentation, something likable, even beautiful, was sure to emerge. But that was last week. Today, he just seems like an asshole. An asshole with spectacular teeth. Have compassion. Have compassion. Have compassion. I repeat my silent mantra, then refocus on John. He's talking about a mistake made by one of the crew members on his show. A man whose name, in John's telling, is simply the idiot. And just then, something occurs to me. John's rant sounds eerily familiar. Not the situations he's describing, but the feelings they evoke in him, and in me. I know how affirming it feels to blame the outside world for my frustrations, to deny ownership of whatever role I might have in the existential play called My Incredibly Important Life. I know what it's like to bathe in self-righteous outrage, in the certainty that I'm completely right and have been terribly wronged. Because that's exactly how I've felt all day. What John doesn't know is that I'm reeling from last night, when the man I thought I was going to marry unexpectedly called it quits. Today, I'm trying to focus on my patience, allowing myself to cry only in the 10-minute breaks between sessions, carefully wiping away my running mascara before the next person arrives. In other words, I'm dealing with my pain the way I suspect John has been dealing with his, by covering it up. As a therapist,
I sat and said nothing, did nothing, like he asked. Sweat dampened my face, and I thought about the 6 patients sealed inside without air conditioning. The generator operated the pressurization, oxygen, and intercom systems only. And thanked God for the portable DVD player to keep the kids calm. I reminded myself to trust my husband, and I waited, checking the clock, the door, then the clock again, praying for him to return. He had to, before Barney ended and the patients buzzed for another DVD. Just as the show's closing song started, my phone rang. Pac. "They're here," he whispered. "I need to stand watch. Make sure they don't try anything again. You need to turn off the oxygen when the session ends. You see the knob?" "Yes, but—" "Turn it counterclockwise, all the way, tight. Set your alarm so you won't forget. 8:20 by the big clock." He hung up. I touched the knob marked oxygen, a discolored brass the color of the squeaky faucet in our old apartment in Seoul. It surprised me how cool it felt. I synchronized my watch to the clock, set my alarm to 8:20, and found the alarm on button. Right then, just as I started pressing the tiny nub, that's when the DVD battery died, and I dropped my hands, startled. I think about that moment a lot. The deaths, the paralysis, the trial. Might all that have been averted if I'd pressed the button? It's strange, I know, that my mind keeps returning to this particular lapse, given my bigger, more blameworthy mistakes of that night. Perhaps it's precisely its smallness, its seeming insignificance, that gives it power and fuels the what-ifs. What if I hadn't let the DVD distract me? What if I'd moved my finger a microsecond more quickly, managed to turn on the alarm before the DVD died, mid-song? I love you, you love me, we're a happy family. The blankness of that moment, the categorical absence of sound, dense and oppressive. It pressed in, squeezed me from all sides. When noise finally came, a rap, rap, rap of knuckles against the porthole from inside the chamber, I was almost relieved. But the knocking intensified into fists banging in threes, as if chanting, "Let me out," in code. Then into full-on pounding, and I realized it had to be TJ's headbanging. TJ, the autistic boy who adores Barney the purple dinosaur, who ran to me the first time we met and hugged me tight. His mother had been amazed, said he never hugs anyone, he hates touching people, and maybe it's my shirt. The exact shade of purple is Barney. I've worn the shirt every day since. I hand-wash it every night and put it on for his sessions, and every day he hugs me. Everyone thinks I'm being kind, but I'm really doing it for me, because I crave the way his arms wrap around and squeeze me, the way my daughters used to, before she started leaning away from my hugs, her arms limp. I love kissing his head, the fuzz of his red hair tickling my lips. And now, that boy whose hugs I savor was beating his head on a steel wall. He wasn't crazy. His mother had explained that TJ had chronic pain from intestinal inflammation, but he can't talk, and when it gets too much, he does the only thing he can for relief. He bangs his head, using the new, acute pain to drive out the old one. It's like having an itch you can't stand and scratching so hard it bleeds. How good that pain feels, except multiplied by 100. Once, she told me, TJ put his face through a window. It tormented me, the thought of this 8-year-old boy in so much pain that he needed to bash his head against steel. And the sound of that pain, the pounding again and again, the persistence, the increasing insistence. Each thud set off vibrations that reverberated and built into something corporal, with form and mass. It traveled through me. I felt it rumble against my skin, jolting my insides and demanding my heart to match its rhythm, to beat faster, harder. I had to make it stop. That's my excuse, for running out of the barn and leaving 6 people trapped in a sealed chamber. I wanted to depressurize and open it, get TJ out of there, but I didn't know how. Besides, when the intercom buzzed, TJ's mother begged me, or rather Pac, not to stop.
Chill taken up and dropped like a woman never wearing the right coat, until finally December laughed and took hold. Then the ice on the black pathways through the park fixed an unreflecting gaze upward, month after month. The cold unwavering through what should have been spring, so that even in April, in the Bowery in New York City, the braziers still glowed on street corners, and a man trying to warm his hands could watch the firelight picked up and carried in the windows above his head, and imagine the glow traveling all the way along the avenues, square by square above the streets, all the way uptown and into the warm apartments of those who, pausing on the threshold to turn off the light, left their rooms and descended in woolens and furs, grumbling about the cold. Good God, when will it end? until it turned without fanfare one morning in May, and spring let loose at last. All over the city, children were released from their winter coats and out into the greening arms of Central Park. So here we all are again, thought Kitty Milton, stepping into the taxicab on the way to meet her mother at the Philharmonic. It was 1935. She wore a soft cloche hat that belled below her ears, casting her eyes into shadow, and making more pronounced the soft white of her chin tipped forward a little upon her long neck. Her coat swung easily around her knees, her upright figure swathed in a foamy green silk dress, the woolen coat just a shade darker. The taxi pulled away from the curb toward Central Park, and through the window spring unfurled above her head in the elm trees, and down along the walkways the forsythia shouted its yellow news. She leaned her head upon the leather. "Life is wide, girls," Miss Scrivener had bid them all years ago. "Cross it with your arms open." And standing before the schoolgirls ranged in rows all 6 feet of her, an old maid her fiancé killed in the Great War, their teacher had thrown out her arms. And Kitty hadn't known whether to laugh or cry. Well, wide it was, Kitty thought now. Spring begun and nothing ahead but possibility. Ogden would be home soon from abroad. The ground had been broken on their house in Oyster Bay. She was 30. It was 35. Nettie was 5, Moss was 3, and baby Joan had just turned 1. Her head filled with a delicious math of life. The word flushed up onto her cheeks and into her eyes, broadening into a smile as the taxi moved up Fifth Avenue. She caught the driver's eye in the mirror, and knew she ought to turn her head away so he didn't see her, smiling like an idiot, but she held his gaze instead. He winked. She smiled back and slid down on the seat, closing her eyes as the taxi plunged into the tunnel moving east to west, underneath the playgrounds in the park where her children were playing with a concentrated fury against the end of the morning, the arrival of lunchtime, crawling around the great bronze statue of a beloved Scottish poet, perching like little sparrows on the giant knee, climbing, if they were lucky, if their nurse wasn't watching, all the way up to his massive sloping shoulder. But the Milton boys were not lucky that way. The Milton boys' nurse told them to get down, right now, get down immediately and come here. Moss, the younger, who did not like when grown-ups looked at him with that distant, frowning attention that signaled more attention coming after, coming closer, slid off the statue too quickly and landed on one bare knee. "Ow!" he mouthed, and lowered his cheek to the hot, scuffed skin. "Ouch!" But his brother had paid no attention to Nurse below him. Their babysitter, Joan, on her big hip. Nettie kept climbing, creeping to the top of the statue's head, and what was he doing? "Edward?" Nurse moved quickly forward. "Edward, get down, this instant." The boy was going to fall. He had planted both feet, one on either side of the great head, the shaggy bronze hair covering the 2 ears, a foot on either shoulder, and was carefully, slowly, pushing himself up to stand, aloft. The boy was going to break his neck. "Edward," Nurse said very quietly now. The other children stopped their crawling, frozen where they were on the statue, watching the boy above them who had climbed so high. Now he was the only thing moving upon the bronze.
Cross east 2 blocks to Fifth Avenue. There you will find Bay Ridge. Our 3-square-mile neighborhood is the melting pot of Brooklyn. On our streets you'll find Latinos, Middle Easterners, Italians, Russians, Greeks, and Asians, all speaking their native tongues, keeping their traditions and cultures alive. Murals and graffiti cover the buildings. Colorful flags hang from windows and balconies. The sweet smell of churros, shish kebabs, and potpourri fills the air, a stew of humanity converging. Get out at the corner of 72nd and 5th Avenue, where you'll find yourself surrounded by bakeries, hookah bars, and halal meat markets. Walk down the tree-lined sidewalk of 72nd Street until you reach an old row house no different from the others. Faded red brick, a dusty brown door. Number 545. This is where our family lives. But our story does not begin in Bay Ridge. Not really. To get there, first we must turn back the pages to before I found my voice. Before I was even born. We are not yet in the house on 72nd Street, not yet in Brooklyn, not yet in America. We have yet to board the plane that will carry us from the Middle East to this new world, have yet to soar over the Atlantic, have yet to even know that one day we will. The year is 1990, and we are in Palestine. This is the beginning. Ezra, Birzeit, Palestine. Spring, 1990. For most of her 17 years, Ezra Hadid cooked dinner with her mother daily, rolling grape leaves on warm afternoons, or stuffing spaghetti squash, or simmering pots of lentil soup when the air became crisp and the vineyards outside their home went empty. In the kitchen, she and Mama would huddle against the stove as if sharing a secret, steam swirling around them until the sunset cast a sliver of orange through the window. Looking out, the Hadids had a mountaintop view of the countryside. Hillsides covered with red-tiled rooftops and olive trees, bright and thick and wild. Ezra always cracked the window open because she loved the smell of figs and almonds in the morning, and at night, the rustling sounds of the cemeteries down the hill. It was late, and the call for the Maghrib prayer would soon come, bringing an end to the cooking. Ezra and Mama would withdraw to the bathroom, rolling up the sleeves of their house gowns, washing the dull red sauce off their fingertips. Ezra had been praying since she was 7 years old, kneeling beside Mama 5 times a day between sunrise and sunset. Lately she had begun to look forward to prayer, standing together with Mama, shoulders joined, feet slightly grazing, the only time Ezra ever felt human touch. She heard the thick sound of the Adhan calling them for prayer. Maghrib prayer will have to wait today, Mama said in Arabic, looking out the kitchen window. Our guests are here. There was a knock at the front door, and Mama hurried to the sink, where she gave her hands a quick rinse and dried them with a clean rag. Leaving the kitchen, she wrapped a black thobe around her small frame and a matching hijab over her long dark hair. Though Mama was only 35 years old, Ezra thought she looked much older. The lines of labor dug deeply into her face. She met Ezra's eyes. Don't forget to wash the garlic smell off your hands before greeting our guests. Ezra washed her hands, trying not to dirty the rose-colored kaftan that Mama had chosen for the occasion. Do I look okay? You look fine, Mama said, turning to leave. Be sure to pin your hijab properly so your hair doesn't show. We don't want our guests to get the wrong impression. Ezra did as she was told. In the hall, she could hear her father, Jacob, recite his usual salam as he led the guests to the salah. Soon he would hurry to the kitchen and ask for water, so she grabbed 3 glass cups from the cupboard and prepared them for him.
had not yet returned with a gun for Hughes when the van reappeared. 5 minutes had passed, yet here it was once more. Same van, same driver. Hughes tensed, but again the van drove right past him. It continued on for 20 yards or so. Then the brake lights flared. As Hughes watched, the back door swung open and several men burst out. They looked like civilians, tracksuits, trainers, but one had a .45 in each hand, and 2 others had rifles. As Hughes turned to run, all 3 of them opened fire. Bullets swished past him, slamming into the facades of the 4 lone houses as Hughes tore off and the men gave chase. He sprinted onto Cypress Street, the men pounding the pavement behind him, still firing, but now Hughes began to zigzag like a gecko into the warren of tiny streets. He knew these streets, the hidden alleyways, the fences he could scale. He knew each vacant house and washing line. There was a quote attributed to Mao that Hughes was partial to, about how the guerrilla warrior must swim among the people as a fish swims through the sea. West Belfast was his sea. There was an informal system in place whereby local civilians could assist young paramilitaries like Hughes, allowing their homes to be used as shortcuts or hiding places. As Hughes was scrambling over a fence, a back door would suddenly pop open long enough for him to dart inside, then just as quickly close behind him. Some of the residents were intimidated by the provost and felt like they had little choice but to cooperate, while others assisted out of an unforced sense of solidarity. When property was damaged in one of Hughes's operations, he would pay compensation to the family. He cultivated the community, knowing that without the sea, the fish cannot survive. There was a local invalid who lived on Cypress Street, Squire Maguire, and at the height of the madness, with fires and police raids and riots in the street, residents in the area would occasionally see Brendan Hughes carrying Maguire on his back a few doors down to the pub so that Maguire could have a pint, then dutifully returning to bring him home a short while later. Once a British soldier in the Lower Falls area caught Hughes in the sights of his rifle. Finger on the trigger, he was ready to open fire when an elderly woman stepped out of some unseen doorway and planted herself in the path of his weapon, then informed him that he would not be shooting anybody on her street on that particular evening. When the soldier looked up, Hughes was gone. With his pursuers still clumping after him, firing wildly, Hughes veered onto Sultan Street. He had a specific destination in mind, a call house on Sultan Street. Call houses were usually regular homes, occupied by ordinary families that happened to double as clandestine provo facilities. Behind one particular door, on a street of identical brick houses with identical wooden doors, would be a secret refuge that could function as a safe house, a waiting room, or a dead drop. The families that lived in these homes deflected any suspicion from authorities. You might show up after midnight, haggard from a grueling day on the run, and they would lift slumbering children out of their beds, affording you a precious night of rest. At the corner of Sultan Street, a baker's van was delivering bread, and as Hughes ran by it, the men behind him let off a volley of bullets which punctured the van and shattered its windows. He kept pushing, sprinting the length of Sultan, desperate to reach the house before one of those bullets caught him. In addition to its other uses, a call house sometimes functioned as an arms depot. Hughes had become known to the British Army for his willingness to flit around the streets of the Falls area and engage their high-caliber weapons with his little World War II-era .45. The troops had developed what one later described as a grudging admiration for this little bugger who had taken on an elite military unit with a handgun. But Hughes recognized at a certain point that he needed heavier weapons if he was going to compete. One day a sailor of his acquaintance came back from a voyage to America with a catalogue for the Armalite rifle, a lightweight, accurate, powerful semi-automatic that was easy to clean, easy to use, and easy to conceal. Hughes
ramp to the transom, and 2 men in folding lawn chairs, legs sprawled straight. Jack and Wynne beached and hailed them, and the men lifted their arms. They had a plastic fifth of ancient age bourbon on the stones between the chairs. The heavier one wore a flannel shirt and square steel-rimmed tinted glasses. The skinny one a Texan's cap. 2 spinning rods and a Winchester Model 70 bolt-action rifle leaned against a pine. Jack said, "Y'all see the fire?" The skinny one said, "Y'all see any pussy?" The men burst out laughing. They were drunk. Jack felt disgust. But being drunk on a summer morning didn't deserve a death sentence. Jack said, "There's a fire. Big-ass fire to the northwest. What you've been smelling the last few days." Wynne said, "You guys have a satellite phone?" That set them off again. When they were finished laughing, the heavy one said, "You 2 need to chillax. Why don't you pull up a chair?" There were no extra chairs. He lifted the bourbon by the neck between 2 fingers and rocked it toward them. Jack held up a hand, and the man shrugged and brought the fifth up, watching its progress intently, as though he was operating a crane. He drank. The lake was a narrow reach, and if the fire overran the western shore, this island would not keep the men safe. "How've you been making the portages?" Jack said. He meant the carries between the lakes. There were 5 lakes, stringing south to north. Some of the lakes were linked by channels of navigable river, others by muddy trails that necessitated unloading everything and carrying. The last lake flowed into the river. It was a big river that meandered generally north 150 miles to the Cree village and the bay. Jack was not impressed with the men's fitness level. "We got the wheelie thing," the skinny man said. He made a sweeping gesture at the camp. "We got just about everything," the fat man said. "Except pussy." The 2 let out another gust of laughter. Jack said, "The fire's upwind. There. We figure maybe 30 miles off. It's a killer." The fat man brought them into focus. His face turned serious. "We got it covered," he said. "Do you? It's all copacetic here. Why don't you have a drink?" He gestured at Wynne. "You, the big one. What's your name?" "Wynne." "He's the mean one, huh?" The fat man cocked his head at Jack. "What's his name? Go home? Win or go home?" Wynne didn't know what to say. Jack looked at them. He said, "Well, you might get to high ground and take a look that-a-way one evening." He pointed across the lake. He didn't think either of them would climb a hill or a tree. He waved, wished them luck without conviction, and he and Wynne got in their canoe and left. On the 3rd day after seeing the fire, they were paddling the east shore of a lake called Blueberries. What it said on the map, and it was an odd name and no way to make it sound right. Blueberries Lake. They were paddling close to shore because the wind was up and straight out of the west and rocking them badly. It was a strange morning, a hard frost early that lingered, and then the wind rose up, and the black waves piled into them nearly broadside, rank on rank. The tops of the whitecaps blew into the sides of their faces, and the waves lapped over the port gunwale, so that they decided to surf into a cobble beach, and they snapped on the spray deck that covered the open canoe. But there was fog, too. The wind tore into a dense mist and did not blow it away. Neither of them had ever seen anything like it. They were paddling close to shore, and they heard shouting. At first they thought it was birds or wolves. They didn't know what. As with the fire,